We are going to be working with Entity Framework Core, and you'll get a pretty good understanding of the code first process, and that includes how to kind of wire up your app and how to apply migrations to actually create a database. And just to provide a little background, Entity Framework Core is a object relational mapping framework that lets you work with objects of a database using code. In the code first approach, uh, basically what you do is you create your classes, and these classes are in our models folder or directory. And from those classes, we end up generating a database and tables. And then once we do that, we can generate a controller and views. And this approach where you start with your classes and you generate the database from the classes is an approach that is useful in domain-driven design. The database-first approach, which we will be looking at later in the semester, basically you start with an existing database. You would have a database Visual Studio project, and you end up connecting that to your web app. And then once you make that connection, you can generate the model classes using the tables. So you take the tables and basically kind of convert them into classes. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite process of code first. There are some kind of important features that we are going to be utilizing in Entity Framework Core. And these features were also in previous versions. And I should point out that for those of you who like to Google and find things on the web to use, you need to be very careful and make sure you are looking at .NET Core 3 MVC. Okay, because this is very specific what we're doing. And .NET Core 2 and .NET Core 1 and ASP.NET, they all function a little bit different. Okay, so that does make Googling for things kind of tricky. So features that we are going to be utilizing. We are going to be deriving a context from DB context. And you are going to be learning quite a bit more about what that all involves and what its function is. We've already had some exposure to data models, and so we'll be working with those again. You will be learning about link queries. That is basically in the controller how we access the data in our database and how we perform CRUD operations. Change tracking, we've actually already looked at that somewhat when we check the model state to see if it's valid. You will note that that is done a lot in the controller when you are dealing with databases. So if we are going to create a new row in a database, or we are going to update existing data, it's always going to be checking that model state. And if it is valid, then we give the commands to update the database. Okay, and that also is where saving changes comes into play. Migrations you will be learning about today. And migrations basically create the code that is used to generate the database and tables. So it's kind of a two-step process. The first step, we create the code, and the second step, we apply the code. And you will see how that works. Uh, in addition to these features, there's lots of new features that are part of Entity Framework Core that were not in previous versions. And there are some features that were in previous versions that are not in this version. So although they're trying to incorporate many of those old features in, they're just not quite there yet. Just to give you an overview of the code first approach, this is, in a nutshell, what we are going to be doing. The first step is to create the models. Then we install Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core tools. So there's two things we have to install. Then we create the context class, which is derived from DB context. And we create the initializer, which is the seed values. So we basically give our table some default data so we can test. Then we add the connection string to app settings.json. And then we modify the startup CS file to enable dependency injection for the DB context objects. So that's kind of a mouthful, but basically we generate some code that passes information on the connection string and the kind of database server we're using, that kind of information. You will see that when we enter that code. Then the next step is to execute the data migrations, which will create the database and the tables. After we do the migrations, we're going to verify that they were done correctly, and then we generate the controller and views. So in this particular chapter of the book, the controller and views are done manually. I am also going to show you how to generate them using scaffolding, because to me this is like one of the major benefits of using MVC and Visual Studio. So I am going to show you how to do the scaffolding so that everything is generated for you. So we will be learning that too. And once you've got your controller and views, then you're going to modify the layout, which has your navigation menu. So you will add to that menu. You will customize the views with your own branding. And finally, we will be adjusting URLs to make them user-friendly. And just a little side note, as we're going through this, there are 3 files that you really need to pay attention to because they contain information about the database and the connection string. It's the context class, the startup, and app settings. Those are 3 very important files in EFCore. And before we get into actually taking a look at the starter file that I'm going to give you and the models, a little note about Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core tools. You need to install the version of EFCore that corresponds to the .NET Core version you are using. So we are using .NET Core 3 or higher. So our EFCore and EFCore tools also need to be 3 or higher. Okay, So you do not want to be using ASP.NET Core 3 and install Entity Framework Core 2. You'd have problems. Okay, so make sure that those versions are in sync. So what we're going to be doing here is we are going to access a starter file that I put on GitHub. And I'm just going to, you can either open in Visual Studio or download it. And I'm just going to clone this quick. And here it is. And you'll see I've given you kind of the starter file to save a little time here on this project. So if you open up the movie model here, you can see that we have a movie ID. That is going to be the primary key. It is an integer. And what that means is that it will end up being an identity column. Entity framework is going to assume, because this has the class name followed by ID, that it is a primary key. And because we have integer here, it will automatically generate a value for it, and it will become an identity column. And then you can kind of see we've got a couple things that are required. We've got a range data annotation, all kind of basic stuff here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and run this thing. And I think it's always a good idea, especially when you download something like this, that you make sure it runs before you start modifying things. Okay, and this is pretty much all there is to this. It's got a home controller with an index action method, and that is it. So not terribly exciting. And what we are going to be doing is we are going to add Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core tools. And this particular project does not have it in here yet. If you add authentication, you will have Entity Framework installed already, but it's probably going to be not the most current version. So you will probably want to do an update to the current version. And for us, it's not installed at all. So we need to come over to Browse, and we're going to key in. And you can see I've done this a few times. What we need is Microsoft Entity Framework. So it's Microsoft.entityframeworkcore.SQL Server. That is what we want. And it is not installed. If it was installed, it would say that it's installed, and then it would show me if there was a more current update that I could also install. But this is showing me that the current version is 3.1.8, and I'm going to go ahead and hit install. And then you see this little message. I'm going to hit OK and I accept. And just in case you guys are wondering, I did already update all of your libraries. So Bootstrap, jQuery, Popper.js has been added. That has all been taken care of. So we have the SQL Server part installed, and now we need to install tools. And here it is. And same version, I'm going to install. And it looks like it's done. And so I should be able to just exit out of this. And I'm going to do a save all and just run a build. And at this point, everything looks good. So our next step is going to be to add a context file.